there's a lot of resistance to really anything that tries to make broad overarching claims about human behavior. And so it can be sort of seen as like, well, you're just saying that death is the cause. Like you're just always saying it's death. And, there's kind of a resistance to that, but their response, the researchers' response is usually, but that's why we do the research. And every single time death is coming out with higher statistical effects and sort of having a bigger influence than everything else. And it's sort of like, even if you don't think it's the biggest influence in our life, it's hard to argue that it's not an influence, because it's something we deal with. Like, how could it not affect us? The fact that we know, the fact that we could die, it kind of gets imbued in a lot of our decisions. So on that note, to give an example of like a concrete way this can change someone's thinking, the very first study of TMT, which had a big effect at the time, was actually done with municipal court judges. And the reason that's significant is because judges are sort of known for their objectivity and rational decision making. And so they wanted to see what would happen with judges who would think about mortality. So basically what happened is the judges were recruited. They were told that researchers were interested in the relationship between personality, again, sort of having that guise of like, this is more about personality, and then court judgments. And the researchers said, we want to see sort of what factors kind of relate to that. So the judges were given a packet of questionnaires, and half of the judges within those personality questionnaires had the one that asked them to write about mortality. The other half didn't. They just had kind of some basic personality questionnaires. And then after completing the questionnaires, all of the judges were asked to set a hypothetical bond for a defendant being charged with prostitution. And so participants in that control condition with no death reminders set an average bond of $50 for the hypothetical woman. And then those who had been reminded of death in the other half of the questionnaires, their average bond was $455. So this was just this really huge difference in results, which is kind of alarming when you think about like that can have real ramifications. And the rationale is that, again, when people are reminded of death, they will have harsher reactions to people who challenge their own worldview. And in this case, the argument is that prostitution goes against most people's worldview, and especially probably judges who like are there to uphold the law. And if it's against the law, it's going to challenge that more. And so after being reminded of mortality, the rationale for how that aligns with the theory is that we know that when people are reminded of death, they have harsher reactions to those who challenge their worldview. And because in this case, prostitution will go against most people's worldview, or especially judges who are there to uphold the law, the judges who had been reminded of death showed more disdain for that, transgression by setting a higher bond, and thereby adhering to their worldview more, because they're like, it's challenged, and it's sort of a way to defend against that worldview by creating a harsher penalty for something. You're sort of validating your own view more. And so that's just one example of how people react negatively towards people or things that can challenge their worldview. And